Good evening. As Joel has introduced me, my name's Liam. And like most children raised up in the UK, I was taught Christianity in school. I had a rough idea of who God was, or at least what my teachers had told me. But ultimately, there wasn't much focus on it. It wasn't really as a focus from Christians. It was just because they had to teach it in RE. And they focused way more on, obviously, as you can imagine, all the critical GCSEs, English, maths, and science, which particularly I myself was quite good at. I was, to the poor detriment of my parents, quite a difficult child. With my autism, I had a lot of trouble with social interactions, a lot of issues with dealing with my emotions in a constructive way. This often ended up with me lashing out at my poor dad, where he had to hold me till, in his words, I beat him black and blue, so sorry for that one. But basically, as time went on, and I was bullied ferociously, regardless of what school I went in, excelling in my academics, but not necessarily relating to people, not understanding people, and not understanding my emotions, what I was feeling, but also how to deal with them in a healthy way. And as life often happens, home lives aren't always perfect, and there are struggles in there that I won't go too deep into. But I really started discovering how the world was broken. I think my first real realization, of everything that school was teaching me as a child was when I got my own laptop. They got it through some kind of scheme, or that's completely irrelevant. But I got my first laptop and I started going through the internet. I started seeing all these natural disasters. I started learning how ill people were, starving, famines, droughts, cancer. And that was my first real thought of how can this God that people have told me about, how can he be loving? How can he be all-powerful? How can he allow all this evil in the world and actually truly exist? It just didn't match up. It made no logical sense to me. And that was my first brush up with atheism, especially as the school kept pushing more and I kept focusing either on schooling or on what I wanted to learn when I was at home. I was very often running away from school due to the severe bullying that I dealt with. I grew resentful, I grew hateful, but I think the most notable thing about me is that I grew prideful over my own knowledge and my own understanding of how I felt the world worked, how in the end I thought society worked, how people worked, and I very much grew into someone that was bitter at God and thinking that he didn't exist, and how dare he even, the thought of him existing, even be acceptable. Where I would lash out at people. And we get to kind of college time where I was starting to make friends. I'd kind of grew my own understanding of how conversations worked, how people worked, where I ran into Joel, who was a professing Christian. And while we had a couple of debates on it, I was very arrogant and looked down on him, viewing his viewpoints as a myth for adults, a fairy tale that he'd been tricked into believing, that he'd been indoctrinated in through his upbringing. We go on a few more years into uni, very much into studying things, but very broken. I just couldn't find what I wanted to do. Nothing seemed to have a reason, to have a point. I just couldn't understand how people just got on through life and enjoyed it, or picked something and just found fulfillment in it. I just saw everything as vain, pointless, because I believed in evolution, I believed in creation, I believed that we were just accidents, that we had no meaning, there was no hope, and everything was pointless, and you could do whatever you want, which is what I did. But I was a much larger size back then, which I know, shocker. But I was probably going past 25 stone, I think, in the hindsight of it. And I got very ill. And basically what started happening was I started randomly throwing up. At first I thought, oh, maybe I undercooked some food or it's a dodgy takeaway. But this just continually began to get worse. And Joel would come back from his time in Exeter, and he wasn't walking with the Lord then. I was smoking weed, as was he, as was the group of our friends. So I was a stoner. I was enjoying getting high, just kind of anything to get me out of my head, I think. I was so hateful of myself. I was so hateful of the world. I just hated everyone. I didn't have a shred of love for anyone or anything because I believed everything was beneath me, as much as I hated myself. An interesting paradox, but that's where I think a lot of this thinking leads to. Once you believe that you're an accident, you don't love yourself and you can't truly love anything. And as my health continued to get worse, and diagnosis took a very long time, I began to throw up every single day, once a day. Then it was every 2 days. Then sometimes I'd throw up 3, 4, 5 times a day. I'd start skipping meals. Even the thought of eating would terrorize me at times because I was in constant pain. I was on meds, but I was also using weed to kind of self-dose and help myself out, to deal partly with the pain, but partly to help my stomach settle enough that I could even take my medication. That was how ill I was. And around this time, Joel started going back to church, and he started pulling me with him. Well, I say pulling me. He very lovingly convinced me. And it's truly through the grace of God, I was so arrogant in how right I was, so thoughtful that I thought that devil's advocate, I thought. I was like, oh yeah, I'd like to understand the other opinion and argue it, because it's a useful thought experiment. So I started going to church, and that's where I met Joel's parents, Mark and Sarah, and they very lovingly invited me back. And I think that was such a culture shock almost for me in my mind, that I was like, what is this wall of love? It's just, the air was different, the people were different, their hearts were different. They remember the smallest little things that I thought no one would give a donkey's to care about. And yet they did. And it baffled me. And I would always often argue over Mark, over theology, over creation. Very much just a battle of wills and my own arrogance, I think, thinking I knew better when I wouldn't even pick up the book to study it. And to fast forward, basically I got really ill. I dropped out of uni. I couldn't work. And I was literally just living off my overdraft because I just couldn't sustain myself. Still smoking weed, picked up now. Smoking a gram or two a day, which is, to put it in for those that don't know, 10 to 20 quid a day I was spending just to, one, help me cope, but two, to help me take my medication. Eventually, they found out it was a large hiatus hernia, so my stomach had strangulated up in my diaphragm. So I needed surgery, but the surgeries kept being pushed off. And this is where my own pride started to break, where I thought my own will, my own strength, my own knowledge just wasn't getting me through. I just couldn't do it anymore. And it was breaking me down, and I'm not quite an emotional man, but I started lashing out at the slightest inconvenience. I was in so much pain, I was losing sleep, and it came to an April 5 years ago, where we were seeing off a friend of ours, and I had to go home because I was in so much pain. I couldn't remember the last time I ate, and every time I tried to drink water that night, I was bringing it up within about 5 minutes. So I was horrendously ill, so weak I could barely open the flat door for where Joel was living at the time, and I ended up in the back garden behind my house, smoking, listening to music, completely broken, just just wanting sleep, just wanting rest, just wanting to just have a drink of water without bringing it up. And it was then and there where the thought of, how does someone like me become a Christian? And I just couldn't get it out of my head. I mulled it over for a good hour, just by myself, thinking it through. And I was like, I need more evidence. And so I found myself downloading the Bible app. I found myself on YouTube looking at Lee Strobel, The Case for Christ, an apologetics man who tried to basically disprove the crucifixion, tried to disprove the Bible, and he couldn't. And I just learned the evidence. I saw the evidence, truly willing to actually look at it and consider it fairly. I looked through that, and then that just really challenged me. And I was at such a broken point where I just found myself crying out to God in the first time, truly crying out to God, going, if you are who they say you are, prove it. Save me. If you are who they say you are, if you are truly the God of the Bible, then please give me rest. I just need rest. I spent a few more hours of that night up to 6 o'clock in the morning trying to pray, trying to read the Bible, but having challenging thoughts, thinking that I was an idiot. What was I doing? What was I thinking? Thinking I'd gone delusional, that I'd gone mad because of the pain, because of how weak I was. It was about a week later where we met up as a group friend in a park, as we often did, and I just couldn't get the thought out of my head. I hadn't told anyone by that point, but I was sitting next to Joel at the time, and I was just stuck with, should I tell him? He'll think I've gone nuts, or maybe he'll laugh at me, or maybe he'll think, I've finally got you now. And it was with how quiet I was that he turned to me and asked me if I was all right and what was going on. And so I told him. I told him that I'd given my life to Christ, that I'd been praying every day, that I'd been reading my Bible. And it was really God's timing that the day after he had the day off. And so I went over to his, and we'd sat down, and we did a Bible study together. We watched a sermon, and that was the true first fellowship I ever had in my life. But it was from there, that day, where I truly knew that I was a new creation, that I was a completely new man. And it was the most joyous thing, which for a man who truly wasn't happy for the last 10 years of his life, miserable and just hating everything. It's the first time I found true, lasting enjoyment in something outside of myself and outside of anything I was doing. And it was on that walk back home where, even though my stomach was hurting, and I saw, it sounds really silly now, but I saw a carton of milk that was left out for someone to pick up. And I went to take it because I knew we had no milk at home, and I found that milk normally helped me. And I made it 10 steps before I finally felt convicted, and I walked back and I returned that. And that's when I truly knew that God was with me, his Holy Spirit was in me, and he was convicting me of my sin. It's not a big monumentous experience. It was a slow opening of my heart for God, but I will never go back. I can never go back. But I truly implore to you, if your world's broken, if your life's struggling, if you feel miserable, if you hate yourself, if you feel everything is pointless, there is an answer. You can look at it up on the wall. It's an empty cross for a reason. Christ has finished his work for you. He took your sin on the cross. He died. He's conquered death because he rose again. And that is open for any one of you here if you do not know Jesus as your personal Lord and Saviour. Thank you.